I am your host, Dr. Paul Harvey, and this is the Burundi to Gombe podcast. In this podcast series, we go on a journey deep into East Africa to hear about a remarkable project led by the Jane Goodall Institute, USA and Tanzania, with support from Jane Goodall Institute chapters and partners from around the world. A project of hope, compassion, and of love. Our journey will take us from the landlocked heart of Africa, Burundi, to the iconic forests of the Gombe National Park in Tanzania, made famous by Dr. Jane Goodall's groundbreaking research beginning in 1960. Today, this region is under threat. Wildlife habitat is rapidly disappearing. Deforestation, climate change, and increasing human population pressure are driving out the species, including chimpanzees, that once called this place home. Thankfully, a dedicated team of conservationists is working tirelessly to create a wildlife safe haven, a habitat corridor from Burundi to Gombe.
It was the first time I got to meet Jane Goodall in person. I'd spoken to her earlier in the year on the phone, but never had met her face to face, and we actually got to meet on the elevator going down on day one, so that was very exciting for me.
That was Debby Cox, African wildlife consultant for the Jane Goodall Institute, telling me how she first encountered Dr. Jane Goodall. It was while attending the Understanding Chimpanzee Conference in Chicago in 1990.
It was the second one they had done. They'd done one 5 years earlier. So it was bringing all of the chimpanzee field researchers and lab researchers together and sharing their knowledge and understanding of chimpanzees. The conference was really interesting and an eye-opener for me. So the first 4 days, all the researchers shared their knowledge of everything that they had learnt about chimps. But all of the researchers' focus was on anthropology, so on how chimpanzees and humans relate to each other and the differences and similarities between them. None of the researchers' focus was on conservation or ecology.
Back in 1990, conservation and ecology weren't really hitting the charts in the scientific research circles, in favour of more anthropological-focused research endeavours. But Debby happened across the work of Dr. Giza Teleki.
So really very few people other than Dr. Giza Teleki was actually interested in the conservation of chimpanzees. And he alerted the group that, if we didn't go out and do surveys and understand how many chimps we actually got there, we don't even know what the condition of chimps and how long they're likely to survive in the wild. And he was very concerned actually with what was going on with what he saw. And of course, Jane was too, because she'd seen it herself in Gombe. And it's really from that Jane set up the Institute to focus not just about her research, but to look at the conservation issues with chimpanzees. So that was in 1990. At the last day of the conference, a woman by the name of Carol Noon gave a talk too. And her talk was on Chimfunji, which was a chimpanzee sanctuary in Zambia, in northern Zambia. And it was pretty much blocking the illegal trade of chimpanzees and other wildlife through DRC into Zambia, and then of course the end route was into southern Africa and then potentially out through their ports and airports to the greater world.
Inspired by the work of Carol Noon, Debby, a former vet nurse for the RSPCA in Australia and zookeeper at Sydney Taronga Zoo, decided that her skills might be of value.
In listening to her and her describing what was going on, you could see that very easily that very well-intentioned people were doing the best they can in the situation, but they didn't really have the skills or experience that someone like I had in captive care, and particularly captive care of chimpanzees. So I sort of felt, well, this was a really easy step into chimp conservation for me by looking first at going into helping sanctuaries out, and then also getting the sanctuaries not to just focus on captive care, but also focus on addressing why the chimps got there in the first place. How do we stop that? How do we block the illegal trade? And then look at the bigger picture of conservation at the same time.
Having caught the conservation bug, Debbie started looking for opportunities to apply her skills to this newfound career pathway.
I then started looking for different sanctuaries that would take volunteers so that I could go and experience it and just see whether I could transfer my knowledge experience to local staff and would it be relevant in those conditions that these people were dealing with. Eventually, the Jane Goodall Institute's halfway house in Burundi offered me a position, and that was for 5 months. So that was January of 93 through to May of 93. And I was also there to help cover the director. The co-director was a veterinarian actually from Australia, Susan Applegard, and she was on maternity leave. She was having her very first baby.
Burundi is a country unknown to most people, often described as the heart of Africa. Debbie explained.
It's a very tiny country in the heart of Africa, and it's actually almost shaped like a heart. So it sits at the top of Lake Tanganyika. It is nestled in between the Democratic Republic of Congo on the western borders. In the north is Rwanda, and on the east is Tanzania. And then a part of the country obviously is on the lake shore of Lake Tanganyika as well. In size, it's less than half the size of Tasmania, or about the same size as Belgium. And currently the population is estimated to be about 12.5 million people.
At the time, the region of East Africa was still a place that only really existed in the imagination of intrepid explorers. But as Debbie explained, those early days in Burundi were a formative part of her wildlife conservation journey and provided her with a foundation for a career in the region that has spanned more than 30 years.
So I was there helping her father co-manage the sanctuaries, and I would take care of obviously all the chimp issues, and he would take care of the administration stuff. And that was really great for me because it gave me an opportunity to really see whether all my skills and learnings could be applied in a setting like Africa and in these situations, and could I actually transfer that knowledge and skills to local staff. Now you have to consider, one, I had a language barrier. None of them spoke English. They spoke either Swahili or Kirundi. So everything had to be miming or by a practical demonstration. But also it was seeing the way that they did things. I learned a lot from them because they had no inhibitions and they had no rules. They just went and did what came natural to them in looking after the chimps. So I actually learned a lot from the local staff as well in what you can actually do in captive care with chimpanzees, which was really great.
But Debbie wasn't yet fully committed to a future at Burundi. A few things needed to be sorted out at home, including her sister's wedding. So it was a few months before heading back to Burundi. It was in May 1990 when she returned to Australia, not knowing when she would return back.
So I left in May. In July, the country had its very first elections, democratic elections in 30 years. And that president that was elected was assassinated 3 months later. And of course, they went into civil unrest and massacres occurred. So Dean and Suzanne had asked the Institute that they wanted to leave by the end of the year. They felt it was not very prudent for them to continue with a newborn baby in such a situation because you never knew when you would have to just pack up and leave. So unfortunately, I couldn't start in January. I asked to wait till April of 1994 because we were building the orang house for the orangs at Taronga Zoo and I wanted to see that project through.
Debbie left for Burundi on Anzac Day, 25th April 1994. 2 weeks after, civil unrest in neighbouring Rwanda erupted into what history now speaks of as the Rwandan genocide. Sparked by the downing of a plane carrying the former president of Rwanda, Juvenal Habyarimana, and former president of Burundi, Cyprien Ntaryamira, on April 6, 1994, hostilities between the Rwandan ethnic groups soon reached crisis point. In the ensuing conflict between the Hutu ethnic majority and the Tutsi minority, it is estimated that 800,000 Tutsi were killed during the nearly 100-day conflict. Over 2 million Rwandans were displaced, fleeing Rwanda as refugees.
President Juvenal Habyarimana of Rwanda and President Cyprian Ntaryamira of Burundi were returning from a meeting of African leaders in Tanzania. At 9:30 in the evening local time, 2 loud explosions were heard, and the plane carrying them and 6 other people crashed in flames. Sustained gunfire and grenade explosions started in the center of town just before dawn and are continuing. The United Nations Force Commander in Rwanda, General Romeo Dallaire, said it wasn't yet possible to say who was fighting whom, nor to evaluate the extent of the violence.
I arrived in Burundi in a very, very uncertain situation and didn't know if I was going to be there for 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months, or, what. We just really didn't understand what was going to happen. And at that time also, the situation that we had with the chimps, we had 10 chimps that were adults living in a cage situation. We had no transport boxes that we could move them with. They didn't have free access to food or water unless we hand delivered it to them. Even water you had to give by jugs, and very little equipment. And nowhere to take them. So there was no sanctuary nearby that we could, pick them up and transfer them somewhere else. There was nothing. The younger ones were a little bit easier to manage and handle at that time. So I also went with the knowledge and understanding that maybe I would have to euthanize half the chimp population and then leave with the younger ones that we could actually handle, and either go out by boat or plane or car, depending on what would be available and safe at that time. So that was a big burden to take. And I thank my years at the RSPCA for buffering me to that burden, because that was something that we had to do many days at the RSPCA too, is make a decision to euthanize a perfectly healthy, normal animal because we had no way of taking care of them. So, humane euthanasia was better than leaving them to a very uncertain and horrible death by basically first would be the thing that would kill them the most, that they'd be dead in 3 days from lack of water, really, if we left them there.
I was amazed at Debbie's stoic dedication to the chimpanzees of Burundi. Having previously only worked in Burundi for a short period of time, I wanted to know why she felt compelled to stay in what was essentially a war zone.
Well, I knew the chimps because I'd met them before in 93, and I knew the staff, and I wasn't prepared to abandon either of them in that situation. I also knew, I had the comfort of knowing I was not the target of the conflict. I could be a bystander and obviously could have been harmed or killed as a bystander, but the aggression, the conflict was never directed towards outsiders. It was an ethnic conflict, and I was just there on the sides, and it was important to remain neutral and calm and respectful to everybody. It was a very interesting time to deal with that, and my focus was the protection and welfare of those chimpanzees, and also the protection and welfare of the staff that were working for us.
Very quickly, things went from bad to worse in Burundi, and so Debbie was left with a decision.
Because the country became so unstable, we got to the point where we knew that we could not guarantee the safety of the chimps or of the staff. We actually lost 2 staff members to being dragged out of their bus and just killed on the side of the road, just going home from work, And so the government agreed that we could transfer the chimpanzees to a newly created sanctuary in Kenya at Sweetwaters. So they got moved in 2 different shipments. So we moved the first lot in January of 95, and that was all the adults because we knew that we needed to get them out first. And then we still were hoping that things would improve and we could still do something for the younger chimps and keep them in Burundi. But everything just started deteriorating further and further. And we just said to the government, we need to do this for the chimps and for the staff. We just can't stay here any longer in this situation. So we did. They agreed. We moved the last 10 across to Sweetwaters in December of 95, and that's when I transferred to Uganda and started working in Uganda instead of Burundi.
Debbie went on to explain why Burundi chimpanzees are so important from a conservation perspective, and why she felt it necessary to help them at all cost during those tumultuous years. She started by telling me about the changing population of Burundi.
If we go back 500 years, when human populations and activities were much lower, you would have had a forest chain, all from the Virungas all the way through to Nyungwe, all the way from Nyungwe, Kibera, down to Bururi Forest, and all the way to Gombe. So they would have been all connected as just one long forest chain through that area. So it's been human activities that has broken that chain up, and now we have these sort of like stepping stone blocks between them. And the chimp populations have become isolated from one another because of that. So Burundi is sitting right in the middle there. If we want the Gombe Stream National Park chimpanzees to survive long term, they will require a gene pool. Their gene pool right now is limited, and if it doesn't have a new bloodline coming in like once every generation, then it will eventually die out due to inbreeding. And that's the same for the smaller populations like the Bururi population. Kibera and Nyungwe is relatively okay. The combined population of those two parks, and because they're contiguous with each other, is probably at what we call the minimum genetically viable population. But those other ones are too small on their own. So connecting them back is critical, really.
Curious about how these populations could become connected, I wanted to know more about the project that Debbie had been working on more recently alongside the Jane Goodall Institute and a host of other organisations. A groundbreaking effort to link Burundi to Gombe in Tanzania.
Yeah, so the southern population of chimps are found in about 4 different forest pockets. And then, and they're like the nice, rich forests that you expect, the Afro-montane forests. From there down to Gombe, it changes. So we have these forests that are created through the Muyombe woodlands, and then you'll get these pockets in these valleys and gorges that become rainforests. And that's like what Gombe is. But all the way along, you can get these pockets of forests. But the Muyombe forest itself is also very important for chimps. Chimps will use it as stepping stones to move from one forest patch to another. And they can actually get food out of the Muyombe forest as well. If it's left alone, then they can also use it as a corridor. And that's the main thing that we're trying to work on, is firstly is to get all of the small pocketed forests in Burundi connected together, and then work on connecting them back to the northern Tanzania. And the Tanzanian team have been working for the last 30 years to reforest the corridor from Gombe all the way up to the Burundian border. And they've done a pretty good job of that so far.
Over the last 30 years, Debbie has learnt a lot about working in Burundi and East Africa, not least of which is with regard to working with local communities. Debbie explains how working with communities is one of the most important parts of any conservation effort in Africa.
Your biggest stakeholders in success of these sort of projects is going to be from the local community. So if you can get their buy-in, if you can listen to them and work with them and ensure that their needs are met at the same time as this, and they can see the benefit of the conservation of either a species. It's pretty easy for an African to understand why forest is important. It's not always for them clear why that animal in that forest is important. But the forest itself, they completely understand. They know that forest resources are super important to them.
Something has positively changed people of Burundi now they are aware about the importance of the protection of biodiversity of chimpanzees and other species, and the importance of the protection of forests.
That was the voice of Leonidas Nzigamiapa. He's one of the people on the ground in Burundi helping on this project. We will hear more from Leonidas in this podcast series. Are you feeling inspired to take action after hearing about the challenges faced by chimps and their carers at Musée Vivant? Did you know that you can help? Find out how by visiting the Jane Goodall Institute in Australia's website, janegoodall.org.au.
Burundi is this conduit between the DRC, and they've got to pass through Burundi in order to get to Tanzania, to get to the ports and the airports for shipment of these chimps generally to the international market. That's where the big money is in the international market.
That was Debbie talking about how Burundi is caught in the middle of the illegal wildlife trade. The illegal wildlife trade is a topic that we will hear more about in the podcast series. But I wanted to get a sense of the problem first from Debbie. She began by explaining the context of Burundi within the larger picture of wildlife trade between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Tanzania.
So most dealer traders are trying to get the chimps where they know they can get the highest price for them. So Burundi is really just a pass-through. At the time in the 80s and 90s, there was about, I think they confiscated about 14, 15 chimps that were being held in captivity in Bujumbura, mostly either as pets or they were being used as like entertainment or attractions.
I asked Debbie to share some details about the welfare of the chimps known to her at the time. A note here, this may be distressing for some listeners.
So one poor chimp, Poco, was in a cage wouldn't have even been a metre wide, it was probably a metre high, and he was strung over a garage, a car garage. So that was the attraction for people to bring their cars to this garage, because this chimp was being strung up like a parrot, in a cage. And all Poco could do was stand up, sit down. He couldn't move in any other way other than stand up, sit down. And that, of course, made, when we got him out of there and put him into a larger area, he always had problems with his hips, and he always continued to walk bipedally, because that's all he knew how to do, and it was more comfortable for him, because I think there was a malformation of his hips because of the situation he was in. So a lot of the chimps ended up, poor nutrition, poor accommodation, housing, so you have psychological problems with them that you've got to try to work through with them, and some won't ever get past it, and others will get past those things over time. It can take up to 10 years sometimes for them to sort of fully let go of that trauma that they experienced when they were younger.
As we explore the topic of illegal wildlife trade more deeply, Debbie let me know that it was actually the illegal wildlife trade that was the catalyst for the Burundian government to reach out to Jane Goodall for help all those years ago.
For us, as JGI, we have a personal collection from back in the 80s when the Burundian government, it's the first time that I know of it happening, and as far as I know, I haven't actually, other than in DRC, I've heard the same thing happen. The Burundian government actually contacted Jane directly through the ambassador of Burundi in Tanzania and requested her help in setting up the sanctuary. They understood that the only way that they could address illegal trade was to confiscate the chimps, which meant they had to take care of the chimps, and they knew that they didn't have the resources or the expertise to do that. So they reached out to Jane and asked her for help to take care of that component of it, and then they would address the illegal trade issue. And so that to me was brilliant, because they identified their problem, they identified where their weaknesses were, what expertise they didn't have, and they reached out to the appropriate people for that help. And if other countries could do the same thing, we could probably resolve a lot more of these issues much quicker.
Wondering about the possible alternative future that the chimps could have faced, I asked Debbie what she thought could have been the outcome if Jane Goodall and the dedicated team had not intervened.
So if we hadn't gone, I think they would have just continued to ignore the trade, and there would probably be 30, 40 chimps in Bujumbura in some manner or whatever. And who knows, maybe local people would have seen that maybe there was money to be made, and maybe hunting of the chimps in their forest could have started. But the fact that the Burundians addressed it and they were very good at it, maybe that saved the chimp populations, and why it's still fairly intact today with minimal, resources.
As we will hear later in the podcast series, the illegal wildlife trade is an incredibly complex issue. But first, I wanted to find out from Debbie why the illegal wildlife trade is so problematic, not just for chimps, but for the entire global environment.
If we hold our breath, we'll be dead in 3 minutes. If we don't drink water, we'll be dead in 3 days. If we don't eat food, we'll be dead in a month. So each of those resources come from our environment. So if we don't look after it, even just the basics of life will be taken from us. So, even just for that reason alone, people should be more concerned and more proactive about trying to stop these illegal activities that are just destroying not just our wildlife, but if you think about the forests, the illegal logging that's done, it's rampant all around the world, and it's getting worse, not better. And each time the illegal loggers win and take more of our forests away from them, that is going to cause more climate change issues for everybody. It's not, and that's what we all need to understand. Like here in Australia, the illegal logging in Asia has a massive impact on us here in Australia because our rain comes from that area. All of the cloud formation that brings the rain down to Australia all comes from those forests across Asia. So if we ignore it and just say, not our problem, it's like, well, guess what? It will be your problem in a few years' time because you won't be getting the rainfall. And you think it's bad now, or wait for what's going to come next. It's going to get a lot worse if we don't actually do something. It doesn't mean that I would never want to say we're at doomsday. I'm always very optimistic and positive. And I've seen in 30 years of working in Africa, I've seen the positive changes that we've been able to do. And a lot of it's just plodding along. You've got to understand that any change is often intergenerational. You're not going to just do it overnight. You've got to be willing to work beside the people for decades to get to where you want to get to.
But even with the best laid plans and community stakeholders on board with conservation, there are still challenges that are faced. In recent years, there has been an increase in the illegal wildlife trade once again. Debbie explains.
So it's only in the last sort of 3 or 4 years that we've started to see the increase of chimps being held illegally as pets or being used in entertainment like they did in the old days back in Burundi. So again, the authorities went, we've got to stop this. We've got to block it and stop it. And so the only facility that they have is called Musée Vivant, which in French or in English means living museum. So it was originally designed to have animals in it, but it was also about a museum to talk about the cultural heritage of Burundi as well. So we got involved in 2020 during the COVID. We were told about the chimps were in a really bad situation, not being fed. The authorities didn't have the money to feed them. So the chimps were really relying on visitors coming in and giving them food. And that was really the only way that the chimps were surviving. So I was sort of contacted while I was in Liberia. And luckily, the head carer for us back in the 1990s was still in Burundi and around. So I still had his contact. So I contacted him and asked him would he do me a favour and go and check and verify what's going on and let me know what needs to be done. So he went and, confirmed that the chimps weren't getting fed very well, and the cages were terrible, and, we need to do something. So for the first 12 months, I was providing him with money to be able to buy the food for the chimps and make sure the chimps were being fed every day correctly. And I did that for 12 months personally until we were able to sort of generate others to come in and help, which is the JGI Australia is now taking the project on, as have Taronga Zoo and Sydney Zoo, and we now also have Rockhampton Zoo and Hamilton Zoo in New Zealand helping out as well with the fundraising effort. So it's really good. There's a lot more momentum behind this effort.
Debbie went on to explain why looking after these chimps in captive care is so critical to the ongoing conservation efforts throughout Burundi and beyond.
If we don't provide proper welfare to these captive chimps, how do we expect Burundians to respect the wild chimps? How do we expect them to respect the wildlife authorities saying this is a protected area, we need to leave it alone, we need to keep these places as pristine as possible, if we're not looking after these guys that they see every day in appalling conditions? You're sending mixed messages. So we need to fix the captive care situation first, and then use those chimps as ambassadors to tell the story about the wild populations as well.
Hearing this, I wanted to know the current situation in Musée Vivant.
We have 5 chimps at Musée Vivant. At the moment, we've been able to build small rooms that we call the indoor facility, and we've got the chimps all housed in those. The next big step is to build an outside enclosure, similar to what you would see in a zoo, and then have them all connected together, and then integrate all the chimps together so they can live. And we will obviously do birth control. We don't want to breed chimps in captivity. Breeding chimps in captivity does not in any way support conservation of wild chimps. We're not going to ever reintroduce these chimps back to the wild, not in Burundi at least, because there is no wild spaces far enough away from human habitation to make it safe to return them to the wild. So they will spend their life in a captive setting, and we want to make that as best we can and to tell the right story to the Burundian population why it's important to keep your forest and the chimps who help farm the forest. Well, that's one of the big ecological benefits of chimps, is they're the big germinators and seed dispersers of rainforests. The next big ticket item for us at Musée Vivant is, as I said, the outdoor enclosure, and we think that's going to cost us at least $300,000. And that may sound a lot of money, but that enclosure that we will build for $300,000, if I wanted to build that here in Australia, it'd probably cost me about $5 million.
I left my conversation with Debbie in a mix of emotions: anger about the illegal wildlife trade, inspired by the great work that people are doing to help conserve the species of chimps and others globally, and also hopeful that the future of chimps in Burundi is looking much, much brighter. I wanted to know what Debbie hoped for in the future of Burundi.
I think what I hope for is harmony and peace between the human populations that live with the chimps, that are their neighbours, that there can be peaceful coexistence and respectful coexistence between them, and that the illegal trade of chimps, we can get it back to where we were in the late 1990s, where everybody respected the law, and the law enforcement people, they blocked them even, right at the border. They just turned them around. And it'd be nice to get back to that and ensure that our 5 chimps that are in care are the only ones that we receive. That would be my number one goal, is that we don't get any more. That we've been so successful with the law enforcement and education that they are the only ones we have to take care of in captivity, and that way we can put all our efforts into the wild population, and that reconnection of the forests from Burundi all the way down to Gombe.
This podcast was produced by me, Dr. Paul Harvey. I want to extend a huge thanks to all of the guests and those people that have worked behind the scenes to make this podcast possible. Please share your feedback, questions or comments to paul@docpjharvey.com. You can find more of my work by visiting www.docpjharvey.com.